all going directly into the amygdala. And the amygdala is then telling us how we should feel about that. Automatically, all the time. How do I feel about what I'm experiencing right now? Okay. And those sensations and emotions become paired in the amygdala. Still largely unconscious. But as the amygdala is working, so is the hippocampus. And it is processing that experience and connecting it with things we have already experienced automatically. If it's fully processed by the hippocampus, we can voluntarily remember it. We can see it in the sequence of things that we've experienced in our lives. We can say, that happened after I finished high school, but before I got to college. Okay? That happened the other morning after I dropped the kids off. Okay? Time does not exist in the amygdala. The raw sensations and emotions, when activated in the amygdala, are experienced as if they are happening right now, whether or not they are in fact. This is the definition of PTSD. Responding to something that is not happening in the moment as if it were. The hippocampus further takes things and works with them for a period of up to 10 years before filing them away in other parts of the brain. We know this from the guy with the metal in his head. He remembered everything that had happened to him up to 10 years prior to the accident, and then it was all dark. Because all the stuff that was only in the hippocampus was gone. The other thing we know is that anything that is in the hippocampus is still forming connections. And it is subject to change every time it's recalled. It may not change, but it could. Does anyone know what confirmation bias is? We have a strong bias towards things that confirm what we already believe. This makes us feel like the world is a safer place, but it really erodes our sense of what's real and what isn't. Okay? We can change either incoming information or already saved beliefs if they conflict with each other. And guess what? You'll do that automatically, and you'll have no idea a moment or two later that you ever believed anything different. Your memory is unreliable in such a way that you will never know if it is unreliable or not. Okay. And there are lots of people in the hard sciences who are telling us that there's really no such thing as objective reality. And there doesn't need to be. We don't have knowledge so much as we have beliefs. Some beliefs are supported by what we call evidence, which means they're consistent with our other beliefs. And some are supported by consensus. In other words, we all believe the same kinds of things, so therefore it's got to be real. Neither one of those things actually has anything to do with objective reality. And I bring this up because when we're in the process of helping someone with trauma, we're dealing with the reality of what's going on in their psyche, not the physical reality of what's going on in the world. They simply need to make peace with what happened to them in their psyche. Whether it actually happened the way they remember it happened, whether it actually happened at all, whether it happened in this life or a past life is irrelevant. And when we try to argue with them about that relevance, we prevent them from finding peace. And that's a part of our process. We don't question. We don't advise. We don't counsel. We don't correct. We don't judge. We simply facilitate a person reviewing events as they recall them and making what sense they can of them. The impact on memory? Lack of memory consolidation between the amygdala and the hippocampus differentiates traumatic memory. PET scan research of trauma victims, they trigger the trauma, person's in a PET scanner, and they find that normally, normal people who are not having non-traumatic memories or experiences, the hippocampus and the amygdala are simultaneously very active. But when somebody's recalling a traumatic event or the traumatic part of an event, the amygdala is active as hell, but the hippocampus is dark, in full or in part. They're not putting the information away. It's remaining in the unconscious part of the memory. Now remember what I said earlier about the transition from the maintenance response to the stress response. It's about resource allocation. Okay? Now we know from PET scans that sometimes in traumatic events, the hippocampus is not active. I'm going to depart from the empirical for a moment and speculate. Okay. Every process takes time and energy. So a part of that resource allocation on the extreme end, when your body believes it is fighting for survival, is, okay. The amygdala says to the hippocampus, listen, I will get back to you if we're still here. We can put this stuff away later. And the hippocampus, in the interest of allowing our amygdala to manage our survival, which is called, actually, in the literature, amygdala hijack, keeps us from processing everything completely into memory. Normally, we fix that ourselves. Oh. Because of that, people with severe trauma histories experience a physical loss of volume in the hippocampus because it's not being used as much. And they also tend to experience an enlargement of the amygdala, which tends to make them more sensitive, sometimes paranormally so. Nobody can read a room like the child of an alcoholic. So the brain is use-dependent. Cues which trigger the original trauma result in a partial or complete shutdown of the hippocampus and an activation of the amygdala. But those triggers also can make the brain locked in an emotional sensory state, and the traumatic state can become normal for the individual. This keeps them in a place where their body is continually producing chemistry that's going to damage the brain and the body. If we get time, we'll get to that point. Also, remember I talked about the memory being plastic, okay? As long as it's being recalled. Triggering or re-stimulating a past traumatic event can cause new perceptions or emotions to connect with it that were not present at the time the original memory was recorded. Okay? This eventually creates a network of events and perceptions that may trigger past traumatic events, usually without the person's conscious awareness. So what this is, imagine a snowball rolling downhill. Okay? The potential number of ways that a traumatic event that's still active can be triggered over time increases unless the event is resolved. Now, what's likely to be around a person when they're triggered? They're not in combat anymore. They're out on the golf course. They're out doing normal things. What's most likely to be around a person if they're experiencing triggers from a past event? I'm sorry?
Sound, smell, and all your sensory?
Yeah, but, in terms of the kinds of, yes, all kinds of things could be around them, all kinds of senses or perceptions or emotions could be a part of this. The things that are likely to be around them when they get triggered later in life are the things that are a part of their everyday life because they're around them more. Their wife, their kids, their living room, their job, their car. Right? And the more times they're triggered, the more opportunities they have to form new triggers. Right? And they don't necessarily know what's going on. So, they experience this rage, they experience this fear, right? And because we have this huge need to know, right, and to understand. When you experience that rage and you don't know, you just have the rage, you don't know that it's because somebody pulled a knife on you 15 years ago. But your wife's in the room and she pissed you off. She had to have. She's the only other person in the room. Right? Makes relationships hard. Thus, people, places, and things that are a significant part of a person's life may bit by bit become triggers and bring about unwanted feelings, emotions, sensations, attitudes, or pains. And that is why people who have not been in combat for 42 years blow their brains out. But we can finish the processing. In cases of trauma, the hippocampus was shut down in full or in part. It's still possible to retrieve, intentionally trigger the memory, and engage the hippocampus and complete the memory processing, and that's what we do. We go through it over and over and over again in an untimed session in a safe and uninterrupted space without judgment, evaluation, advice, and simply allow the person to finish processing it with the hippocampus on. And then it's just a normal memory like any other. Okay. Resolves it, turns it into just another memory. It's that simple. Okay. In indigenous cultures, they do this a lot of different ways. They use plant medicines, they use sacred ceremony. You might sit around in a sweat lodge and nobody's keeping the clock, right? Talk about what you need to talk about. Experience what you need to experience. Find peace with it. There are procedures in community in Polynesian culture. There's this process called Ho'oponopono. We frequently have learned about it as an individual process, but it's also a community process where people basically hold a sacred space for somebody to process something that has happened to them. Okay. Now, how many of you have experienced something like you've witnessed a shooting, or you've witnessed a crime, or you've been in a car accident? Okay? When you got out of the current craziness and you got home around your family, or you got to the office, what's the first thing you did? When you were around people you knew and trusted, what was the first thing you did? You talked about it, right? And the next day, if it was on your mind, you talked about it. And the next day, if it was still on your mind, you talked about it, right? And when you were done, it wasn't traumatic anymore, right? Well, in studies about mass trauma, we find that there are essentially three different kinds of responses. Okay? The Kennedy shooting, the other Kennedy shooting. God, we live in a weird country. The Challenger explosion, the Twin Towers, lots and lots and lots of people experience exactly the same thing. Some have no PTSD. They coped with it in the moment. They never hit that red line, right? Their hippocampus never went offline. Some people developed PTSD, but they had support networks, and they talked about it, and they talked about it, and they talked about it, and 6 months later they didn't have PTSD. And some experience persistent PTSD until somebody comes along with an intervention that allows them to process it. So mental health, so trauma is not a mental health problem. Something happens to everybody. And we need to start dealing with it in an unstigmatized way because stuff happens to everyone. It's an essential response. It's designed to help keep you alive. But afterwards, you need to finish processing it. And if you don't, all of these things can happen. There are some interventions that are successful. Seeking safety is a group model. It's about coping and managing. We want to get beyond coping and managing, but sometimes it's necessary to cope and manage until you can. Medications are the same thing, right? Medications aren't the best way to deal with, but sometimes they're necessary because people have to function well enough to be able to process. Okay? Yoga helps to integrate the central nervous system. Breath work helps to activate some of these memories so we can get at them and process them. It helps with the repair of the body. Massage, acupuncture, Reiki, sound bowl meditation, all these kinds of things can be helpful to somebody who's experienced trauma, either as a coping and managing strategy or as a way of helping them relieve the symptoms in their body. EMDR is helpful. We use traumatic incident reduction because it's the most effective thing that we know about now. Okay. It was on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Principles, Programs and Practices. I say was because sometime last week, that registry of evidence-based non-pharmaceutical interventions on the SAPSA website went dark. It was intentional. They pulled the plug on it. You could accept the press release that they sent out that basically said that, research being what it was, we really don't know what's evidence anymore. And that's true enough. The two principal editors from the New England Journal of Medicine said several years ago that they no longer trust anything that's published in any of the journals because medicine and research has become so corrupted. Or you say, oh, these are non-pharmaceutical interventions. I wonder who paid to have the plug pulled. I mean, if you were cynical, you might say something like that, right? I'm going to show you a live session that we use in training. You can shut off the thing. It takes about 12 minutes. It's a condensation of about an hour session, all right? Don't worry if you can't hear or see. This is a repetition, and you're going to get it all eventually. And if you don't, I'll explain it to you. But this is the process. This is traumatic incident reduction. In this particular case, it was a thematic, all right? This happens when we don't know the specific incident. We simply have an unwanted feeling, emotion, sensation, attitude, or pain that continues to recur in a person's life and they don't know why. All right? In this case, she was having panic attacks. So let's just take a look at that. Let me see here. You can turn the recording back on. Okay, I'm going to kind of recap that in case you missed anything, okay? Her presenting issue in that session was that she had frequent panic attacks when she became the center of attention in a group of people. She did not know why. Began by going back to a recent time when that happened. That happened when she was being taken out for lunch on her birthday by her co-workers. And she panicked and she was shaking and her peas were falling off of her fork. Incidentally, we also know that she has not had any recurrences of panic attacks in the many years following this session. Okay. She was directed after a couple of repetitions about that. Is there an earlier similar incident? She said, yes. When I was 5 years old, I was saying grace at the kitchen table. Okay. And she started to go into that, and she spontaneously remembered an earlier time. When she was 2, they were eating on the family breezeway, and rats started coming down the screens from the ceiling. Now, at 2 years old, it's kind of freaky, but her father's on the spur-of-the-moment solution to pour boiling water on them to kill them made it just a little more horrific. Okay? Now, most of what the facilitator said, and you'll notice we use different language. We're not a counselor, we're a facilitator. We're facilitating the person's process. And most of what the facilitator said during the entire hour session was, okay, go back to the beginning of the session, to the beginning of the incident, and tell me what happened. Go back to the beginning of the incident. Okay. Go through to the end of the incident. Okay. Tell me what happened. Okay. Go back to the beginning of the incident. Okay. Go through to the end of the incident. Okay. Tell me what happened. So, the person's mentally going to the beginning of the incident. Then we tell them to go through it, which means to play it in their head. And then, okay, tell me what happened. So they're basically vacuuming up that active, emotional, sensory state. And you'll see, with each repetition, she gets different pieces. Oh, my skin is crawling. Oh, I'm so hot. I'm so hot. Well, yeah, she's in Tampa on the breezeway, probably because they didn't have air conditioning, right? Okay. It's the panic. It's the fear, right? And then she starts putting things together. Yes, I understand now. Yeah, it's the element of surprise, you know? So she's connecting the panic attacks that she has with this experience. And then, of course, she's able to talk about it very flatly. Well, you know, my father, you know, when rats came down, and, you know, my father poured, and it was really mushy. It seems funny now. Not really funny, but it's kind of, you know, icky. But, you know, it's not, like, horrible anymore. You know, I couldn't believe an hour ago that it would seem like nothing. But now it does. This is a good one because it's just rats. Okay. I could show you other ones if we had them recorded. People being raped, people being hit with a piece of rebar and waking up in the hospital a month later. Okay. All kinds of other things that have happened to people. But this was just rats. It's easy. You probably don't have rats in your background. Probably not likely to be triggered by this one. But now she doesn't have panic attacks anymore. She had them for 40 years. An hour. 1 hour. So why, if unresolved trauma is so costly and causes so much suffering, and it's so simple to resolve trauma, why don't we? Consciousness is hard. Exactly 100 years before the ACE study, Freud found out exactly what Felitti found out 100 years later. People were having sex with their kids. Nobody wanted to hear it. He repudiated his findings when the backlash threatened his career. Nobody believed him. But also, it came a little closer to home. He wrote a letter to his friend, explaining his misgivings about the process. In all cases, the Father, not excluding my